Professor Manning, thanks a lot for talking to Maclean.
Okay, thank you.
At your conference, seventh one, you were just
Yes,
telling me
yes.
this is the seventh one. First general question about that. Is it possible in a nutshell to say how you've seen the conference evolve over the years? How does it differ now than what it was when you were setting out with this
Well, we
thing?
position it as sort of a meeting of the conservative movement as distinct from the parties. Like the party, there's party people here, but we say the movement includes the think tanks, the interest groups that are push market-oriented ideas, the training institutes, the critics, students that are kicking tires. So it's kind of a broader thing, and it started with that idea, but very small. But it's grown now to 700, 800, 900 people that come, and from across the country. So we've been pleased with how it's evolved. It's really a get-together of the movement people.
As a journalist, it's always interesting for us because we get definitely a conservative perspective, but quite a wide-ranging conservative perspective here.
Yeah.
Do you find, as you become more of an established event on the Ottawa calendar, that there's pressure for you to avoid sensitive subjects or to take on certain subjects? Does that kind of come into play in organizing?
Well, there's a bit of that, but it's not the same as a party convention. Where like a party convention, these, no matter what party you're talking about, they're tightly controlled now because they're desperately afraid of some mistake, somebody going off on a tangent, or particularly if you're a governing party, something that's at variance with where the government, then you've got a big problem.
Yeah.
But this is a much more relaxed environment. We have different perspectives on the issues, and people will discuss them, but there's no vote, there's no resolution at the end. So I think it's a more relaxed, and therefore there's an opportunity to discuss the pros and the cons of different positions that you don't find at the tightly managed party conferences.
I want to ask you about two or three of the themes that seem to be represented here, but maybe I could start with energy and the environment, because I happen to catch both. You had a premier's panel, premier's panel here that was focused around that, but I also heard an expert sort of discussion around market solutions to environmental problems, and we think of carbon tax, I guess, as being or carbon prices, some of it being the sort of headline one of that. What do you think about that issue? On the one hand, I would argue that the purest description of a conservative approach to policy that I ever hear at these things is people talking about the need for free market instruments to put a price on pollution. On the other hand, despite the fact that it seems like such a robust conservative position, it doesn't have a lot of traction with big parts of the conservative political movement in this country. Why does that dichotomy exist, do you think?
Well, I think it's something that has to develop. I use this argument that conservation, conservative, come from the same root, that living within your means, which is the heart of fiscal conservatism, is actually an ecological principle. We have to live within our means ecologically, so it's no big jump. And that conservatives profess to believe in markets, and therefore ought to prefer market-based approaches to dealing with pollution to massive government intervention. The way if people are hung up about carbon pricing or climate change, I said, then don't start there. Your conservative principle, start somewhere else. Start with garbage. Start with industrial and household waste. You can apply pricing mechanism, market mechanisms. Start with water. Now, southern Alberta, there's water shortages. Start with if you've got to hang up here, but don't throw out the whole concept that your market concepts actually can solve something. Don't throw it out because you're hung up on one application. And we can kind of say that at this conference, where if you said it at a party conference, it would be seen as controversial, and it would just cause a headache for people.
I think it's because people equate putting a price on carbon with raising taxes, right? And there's a natural conservative version to anything that sounds like you're talking about raising taxes. To me, it seems almost as simple as that.
That's a challenge, and then of course you can get into, you can have offsetting taxes. If you don't want it to have an effect on people's bottom line, you can reduce some other tax in order to accommodate that price.
Right.
But I almost don't get into that. If I find someone's hung up on that, then say, okay, well, apply your conservative principles to some other form of environmental protection, but don't abandon the whole field because of your apprehensions in this particular area.
Another policy area or a preoccupation of government that I associate with you is the idea of democratic reforms, government being more responsive to grassroots opinion. My impression being around Parliament Hill here is that has waned in recent years, and one of the reasons, but not the only reason, is because Senate reform seems to have been just blocked.
There's just a discouragement. The government, to be fair, put its democratic eggs in the Senate reform basket, and we can take some of the blame or the credit for that. We hammered away on that for years and years. But then the court virtually made it impossible to go down that route, which is it took away the one major democratic initiative the government was committed to. So I think it's discouraging to democratic conservatives that was cut off, not by an action of the government so much, but by an action of the court.
Where should people redirect their energies now if they're interested in that side of politics?
Well, I still wouldn't. I think there's going to be a contest between to what extent do some of these court decisions end up being anti-democratic, and that is a good one. The public showed that we have polls to show a large number of Canadians want that institution reformed, and now they differ on what they mean by that, but they want that reform. The fact that the court has thrown a roadblock right in the front of that becomes a democratic challenge. Is the when the Supreme Court is dictating democratic policy, is that really something that the court should be doing? I think it's going to show put some more light on analyzing the role of the court.
We're not even at the midpoint of the conference yet, so I was curious about what sorts of things you're looking forward to seeing, what themes are really top of mind for you as you look at the rest of the weekend.
Well, our polling shows these economic issues at the top of the mind with the public, so that's why we've got so much emphasis. What does it mean to move forward on the economy, move forward on energy and the environment and the economy? But the other thing that our polling showed is this concern about security at home and abroad has come up on the scale.
Reasons.
Yes, but quite significantly. So responding to that, we've got a number of speakers. We have an Islamic scholar from the U.S. who's going to talk about Islamic extremism. We have Martin Lee, the father of the democratic movement in Hong Kong, talking about the threat of Beijing's state-directed democracy versus citizen-directed democracy. And I think Jason Kenney, who's going to give the last address, one of his first as defense minister, is going to touch on the Ukrainian-Russian situation. So that concern about security is certainly it's getting a lot more attention here than, say, it would have 2 years ago.
Picking up on what you've just been saying, obviously you've always shown a great concern and sensitivity about the place of faith in the public square in Canada. Are you concerned by the way Islam is being depicted in some of the debates surrounding security and terrorism? How would you suggest that people should talk about the fact that obviously some of these concerns do raise questions about radical Islam without, I guess, widening the rhetoric to the point where it's intimidating to people who are moderate and great Canadian citizens who are
my
Muslim?
experience with dealing with extremism, whether it's within your own camp or political parties or on the religious side, is the best people to deal with it are the moderates of that same faith, because they understand the extremists far better than someone from the outside.
Right.
So I think if that's going to be dealt with, it has to be dealt in the final analysis by the moderates within that community. And what others of us that are outside that community can do is support them and encourage them. And that's why I'm quite interested to hear what this Islamic scholar has to say on that, because he's a Muslim, he understands that community, but he himself is alarmed by the extremism.
Very interesting. Do you like getting back to Ottawa, Preston, or are you glad to be away
Oh
from
yeah,
it?
no, I don't mind coming to Ottawa. I don't miss the question period or that part of it.
But the media, you missed the media.
Oh yes, that's right. I knew I was groping for something.
Beautiful. Thanks for talking to Maclean's. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
See you again. Bye-bye.
Hey, I'm Nick Taylor-Vasey. I'm with Macleans.ca, and we're here at the Shaw Centre in Ottawa at the Manning Networking Conference. We're asking delegates between the second floor and third floor of the convention centre to tell us where they see Canada in 5 years.
In 5 years, I see Canada maintaining a place on the world stage as a strong economic leader and a role model for diversity and peace. And I also see Canada in 5 years being the prosperous and enjoyable country to live in that it is today. I'll see it being just as prosperous in 5 years.
So Virginia, you have written extensively about glamour, but is there a way to sort of in a nutshell kind of explain what that idea is, what idea you're trying to get at?
Right. So I'm trying to get people to think about glamour not as a style, but as a form of persuasion, nonverbal persuasion. It's mostly about images that may be literal photographs or they may be in our minds. But you see something glamorous and it makes you feel, if only life could be like that, if only I could live in that world, drive that car, have that dress, be with that person. And this applies to politics because a lot of what politics is about is if only I could live in that world.
Because the idea will obviously, like when you talk about politics, I think there are a few obvious sort of candidates that come up, Obama in the States, Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, and his father here. But does that glamour apply to a lot of politicians, or most politicians even? Like I think of even Mitt Romney or George W. Bush had a certain kind of glamour.
No, most in democracies, politicians tend not to be glamorous. They may be charismatic, they're often better than average looking, but they're not glamorous because glamour requires mystery. You always have to have mystery to have glamour, and we generally in democracies don't like our politicians to be especially mysterious. We want to know everything about their health, their finances, every gaffe they've ever made, and so it's very hard to sustain glamour as a politician.
So what would be the mystery of Obama then? Like, how does that, what kind of sets him apart from
Okay,
others?
so Obama in the United States, I can't say maybe it's still in the world. In the United States, I would say Obama is no longer glamorous.
Right.
He was intensely glamorous in 2008. His supporters projected onto him everything they wanted in a country, in a world, in a president, of course. And he was able to be mysterious because, first of all, he was a relative newcomer. He'd been in the Senate, but not for a long time, and he wasn't from a famous political family. And he had this an exotic background. He was biracial. He grew up in Hawaii. Very different from ordinary American life, even ordinary African American life. And that was actually his wife, Michelle, was very important in that original 2008 campaign to sort of ground him. She's very stylish, but she is like a regular person, right. Sort of a scaled up version of a regular person. So he was glamorous and she was sort of the girl next door, so to speak.
So is it, how much of it is asking voters to think about ideals and to think about sort of an idealized version of what kind of a leader they want? Like, is it, in addition to the mystery,
right.
are people aiming for like sort of like the movie star
right,
president?
Yeah. Well, glamour is always about ideals. Glamour starts with the audience's sense of discontent and promises them a different, better life in different, better circumstances. And that can be anything from, if I could only be on the red carpet, or winning an Oscar, wouldn't that be great, to you vote for this person and you live in the ideal world. So in the political realm, more than politicians, glamour comes in, sometimes in the way policies are described. They'll sort of magically solve problems, and you hide, glamour always hides things and hides the difficulties. And often in your ideal of perhaps of the leader, but even more of the country. Ronald Reagan was very successful as an American politician, partly because he was a movie star and he was graceful, physically graceful, and he always hit his mark. But a lot of it had to do with the way he described the country. And he could say, the city on a hill, and that resonated with people. That was the country they wanted to be, and that was a lot of Obama's support in 2008. And you see in the two generations of Trudeau's different ideals being represented, different ideals of a person and also of the country.
So it isn't just a liberal, glamour isn't just a liberal idea. Because conservatives, I think, would say to themselves, well, we don't have the sort of glamorous, superficial sort of leaders that other parties have, but Ronald Reagan was a glamorous guy.
Right. No. Everybody thinks that glamour is for the other people,
right.
Because glamour has an illusion at its core. There's always something. It's an illusion that tells certain truths, but there's always an illusion. So, you are always tough-minded and the other people fall for the glamour. So men think that only women fall for glamour, and liberals think only conservatives, and conservatives think only liberals.
Right.
But it's a universal phenomenon, the same way humor is a universal phenomenon. It just takes different forms for different people, and in the political realm, different politicians or policies.
So if you're a voter and you're trying to understand politics and politicians, and you're trying to be conscious of glamour, is it something you should fear? Is it something you should be conscious of? Is there any positive aspect to it?
Well, glamour, I'll say something general for glamour in our lives, and it applies to politics, which is glamour is very good at revealing what we want. And it's often very good at pointing us in a good direction, which it's often people are drawn to careers because they have a glamorous vision of the career. Well, if they're going to actually pursue the career, they're going to learn all the unglamorous parts. So what I always say is that glamour can only be a guide. It's not the destination. You have to, if you're thinking about actually acting on glamour as opposed to just having a moment of enjoyable contemplation, you have to think about what's left out. What are the costs? What are the difficulties? What could go wrong? What are the things that I'm not thinking about? And that's as true in politics as it is in deciding where to go to college or who to marry or whether to buy that dress or that sports car.
So it's almost, there's a certain, you have to bring a certain skepticism, I guess, to it.
You have to bring a very particular kind of skepticism, which is not just to say, oh, it's bad and it can't tell me anything real, but to say, okay, I like that picture, I like that idea, but what's being left out of the picture? And in the political realm, that's often, okay, well, we're going to pass this regulation. It's going to have these positive effects. Well, what are the negative side effects going to be? Or we're going to go to war, and we're going to solve this problem. We'll confront this enemy. Well, what are the different ways that could go wrong? And do we have an exit strategy? And all of those kinds of things that actual, let's say, generals would have to think about, but maybe the general public doesn't.
Perfect. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks.
Here with Professor Reese Kesselman from the School of Public Policy at Simon Fraser University. Reese, thanks for sitting in. You haven't yet done your event here at the Manning Networking Conference, but can you just, for those people who have been following your really interesting work on income splitting, could you just sketch for us, what are your concerns with the policy? Why are you becoming a sort of a vocal critic of the stance the government's taking?
Okay, most of the focus, in part, some of my earlier research and many other think tanks right across the political spectrum has been concern over the distribution across types of families, income, where the benefits are very disproportionate for upper middle and high income couples, single parents getting nothing, low and moderate earners getting nothing. But I think that's just the beginning of a list of objections and concerns about income splitting, and those I detail in my Caledon Institute paper more recently last fall.
Which has been widely read, I know, by people who are interested in this policy debate.
Yeah. So it gets into issues such as the disincentive for married women to enter the workforce, economic inefficiency of income splitting, which has been assessed in the so-called learned journals for many years. There are issues about gender equality, what happens when women are discouraged from re-entering the labor force, particularly after their kids are, well, certainly preschool age, but even after a couple of years, their lifetime earnings ability, what happens on marital dissolution when they don't have the earnings power that they would have.
To split.
Sure, and income splitting also does bias people's relationship choices between being single and cohabitation and marriage on the other hand. So often we look at the US and we say, well, they do it, they've been doing it a long time, but in fact it's a kind of odd historical circumstance that the US has. It's joint filing, but it's somewhat comparable to income splitting. It goes back to about 1948 and various legal issues between states that had community property laws and others that had common law property rules. At any rate, many analysts in the US, economists who are in the tax area and also legal scholars in the tax area have assessed the US system. They really think the US should go to individual filing.
Something like what we already have.
What we have here, but politically, it's once you do it, it's hard to turn it back.
Could I ask you, given that we're at the Manning Conference here, a place full of small c and large c conservatives, is there a way to frame your argument that you think should be particularly appealing to conservatives? Is there sort of a conservative case for not doing income splitting?
Well, we could take the roughly $5 billion that our federal government is pouring into both splitting and the universal child care benefit increases, a few other smaller items, and say, what are really pressing priorities for families and children in Canada? Dispersing $5 billion in a way that just going willy-nilly all over and no strong purpose. I mean, it's really a political document that was done last fall. Not surprising, governments do it in their budgets all the time, but we do have pressing needs. They would deal with single-parent families, they would deal with low and moderate earners. They would deal with issues of mothers and fathers with newborns and toddlers, their ability to take parental and maternal leave, where it's limited to just under a year under the employment insurance program. $5 billion could,
Give a really
even
long
a fraction
leave.
of that could give you a 2-year leave.
Yeah, that's interesting. More like what the Scandinavians do now.
That's right. And these are all conservative family values items, and we have to be concerned, even for those of us who are at middle or high incomes, about what happens to kids growing up in vulnerable situations in terms of income. They're going to be the workers and the voters of the future, and we want them to be mentally, physically healthy as well.
Reese, we're talking mainly about income splitting, but the government,
Right.
as you've already alluded, has packages together with a universal benefit. And you know very well that the response that will come from people defending the policy is, well, yeah, income splitting maybe helps higher income earners more, but we also have this general benefit going. Have they not blunted the sort of criticism you're bringing at them somewhat by extending some other benefits more widely?
Absolutely. They have spread it and dispersed it, but in a way that doesn't make a great deal of sense if you look at pressing needs. The UCCB increase is $60 per month and a new $60 for those age 7 and over. Once you parse that through, that it's taxable to the lower earning spouse, that they've removed the child tax credit, it works out to about 55 cents a day per child on,
Is that what
on
it
average.
is?
55 cents, yes. They've taken away a large chunk in canceling the child tax credit. So, and for when the lower earning spouse is sort of a middle earner, it's more like 30 cents a day.
So not
Now,
much really.
It's peanuts. Why? But there's so many millions of people affected, it adds up to the billions.
I see.
Let's use more of a scalpel than a shotgun approach and ask what are real important needs of families and children in Canada.
Can I ask one more question before I let you go?
Right.
Beyond these interesting questions about how the benefits are dispersed, the sort of dispersal questions that you talk about, I know that sometimes advocates of the income splitting policy come back to what they say is a fairness argument, that beyond the questions of who benefits to what degree, there's just the question of, the thought experiment. It's a couple, they're each making 50 grand, living in one house. Next door is a couple where the one spouse makes 90,000, the other makes almost nothing, and the tax situation of the two households,
Right.
even though their total income is equal, is very uneven. Do you buy anything about that?
No,
argument?
and I'm not original on this. This is for analysts of critique for decades. They're not comparable.
Right.
The family which has one partner at home,
Making all or most of the money, or sorry, the other partner making all or most
that
of the money.
has one at home, has all that leisure time and home production time. They don't have to hire daycare, which can be very costly. They have many things that are part of their total economic resources. If we look only at money income, we're not looking at their total economic resources. The two families you mentioned are not equals. So this concept of horizontal equity, which does come out of economics and to some extent legal concepts, has got to be applied properly. Total economic resources, not just money income.
You're not
Time
buying
is very valuable to people and very valuable in the
I know
home.
yours is you're off to do your presentation here.
I am.
Thanks for sitting down with Maclean's, Professor. Appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. Thank you.
Peter, thanks for joining us today. You just spoke about evidence-based policy and things of that nature in a session. And federal conservatives in Canada over the last few years have earned a reputation from their critics, including some journalists, as not being all in favor, at least openly in favor of evidence-based policy. But you just spoke about that for quite a bit of time. Can you talk about being a conservative and speaking a lot about evidence-based policy in your case largely at the council level in Calgary?
Yeah, I think with municipalities there isn't really a liberal or a conservative or a libertarian position on most of these issues. Really it comes down to what works at a city level, and that's going to really depend on the city and the particular issues in those places. So the kind of research and reports that we do really look at the stats. We do a lot of data work, a lot of analysis, and we really want to pull out objective information, objective data, because we publish our reports publicly, we publish all our data, all our sources, and people can come in with their own subjective analysis and apply their own thinking to it. But we want to get the information out there in a really accessible way and allow people to come to their own conclusions. I think we've found some pretty interesting conclusions across a wide variety of different issues. So,
Sure. In Calgary, I mean, you have Manning in your name, and you're talking about being objective. Do people on council and in the city's administration, do they treat you as sort of a, you know, as a force worth listening to?
Yeah, well, we have, there's the Manning Centre in Calgary, which is the more political wing, and it's a non-profit that does
Sure.
that political activism. But at the Manning Foundation, we're a charity, and so we have strict rules around the kind of work we can do. We basically have to be objective. That's part of the rules. We can't put a political spin on it. And so that's why we really do focus on that data side. And I think maybe there was a bit of skepticism from some of the councillors when we started, because they thought, you know, well, it is the Manning name, and so there's going to be a particular perspective coming from that. But I think over time, as we've released different reports and we've taken positions, and sometimes the positions have surprised different councillors from across the spectrum, they've come to realise that we really do mean that we mean it when we say that we're focused on the data and we're focused on what that shows. So whether that means finding policies that can improve cycling without hurting motorists, or working with different councils on different issues. We've had left-wing councillors talk about free market issues and come out in favour of some of our reports. We've had Conservatives oppose some of the things we've been suggesting. So I think that proves that actually we're doing our job correctly, we are being as objective as we can. And if we're getting the information out there, then people can go on the website, they can look at it themselves and come to their own conclusion, as I hope the councillors have as well.
Sure. Does work like yours get done at a lot of major cities in Canada?
There are other very good think tanks in Canada. Mostly they focus on the federal and the provincial level. Mm-hmm. Some of them do reports on municipal issues, although that's often how provincial rules affect cities and how they interact with each other. And then obviously some issues are naturally more appropriate to municipal, whether that be housing affordability, because that's the area that councils work in. But we're really the only group that is really focused on municipalities and is aiming a lot of our resources and our time and effort at those kinds of issues. We've spent the last year really focused on Calgary issues. A bit of a trial run, obviously. It's our home base, so it's easier for us to start out there. And we really want to work now on spreading out to other cities. Firstly, to be able to improve those cities and come up with new ideas for those cities. But also data becomes a lot more valuable when you have comparisons. So we could say that the Calgary Council meets in private 25% of the time. But if you don't know the percentages that other cities are meeting, that's kind of just a number. When we tell you that Ottawa is in private for 3% of the time, then suddenly you have some context.
Sure.
And if we can start adding 5, 6, 7, 10 different cities into that data set for this particular report, same for other issues, then it becomes a lot more valuable. The sum is greater than the parts, if you like. So we really want to focus on expanding out into other cities as well.
Right. And each of those cities will pose different challenges, right, as far as getting that data is concerned. Can you talk a bit about that and how it might be easier in some places, more difficult in others?
Absolutely. So we're not targeting necessarily just the largest cities. We're really, we've taken some time to look at how cities operate, how they publish data, what is available. And so we're targeting our own resources in a way. We're trying to be efficient with our resources in that we're focusing on cities where we can get the information in a clear, usable format, that we can publish ourselves, make sure so that anyone can go in and peer review and check the data themselves. And we want to be able to process it in an automated way where possible, so we don't have to have dozens of people sitting at computers doing it line by line from minutes of reports. In the cases where larger cities don't do that, we'd love to go to them and discuss with them and say, hey, look, this is a relatively minor change you can make on your end to ensure that your documents are laid out in a certain way and you're publishing in a certain format and there's a set of standards. And I think once we have that experience with a few of the cities that do those kind of things, we'll be in a position to go to those cities and say, hey, look, let's talk about this. Let's try and come up with some kind of standard, some kind of format that everyone can generally agree on that allows things to be done digitally. And that will obviously greatly help us with our research. But any other group in Canada that wants to be looking at these kind of things will be benefiting from those kind of changes, because obviously we want the public to be able to access as much information as possible. We know that turnout rates for council elections, for example, are very low. So the more we can get people interested in talking about these kinds of issues, following what the councillors are doing, what's going on at City Hall, the better for everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
No problem. Great. Thank you.
I really want to see Ontario having turned itself around. I want to see 5 years of balanced budgets. I want to see an end to the taxes that are being proposed, like the carbon tax. I want to see debt reduction. Our debt's approaching $300 billion. I think that if we can do that, Ontario can restore itself as an economic engine in Canada instead of the have-not province it is today.
So we're here with Chuck Strull, former Conservative MP, former cabinet minister. Chuck, you came up with the Reform Party, you then transitioned to the Conservative Party. How would you describe, or what would you say the sort of the Harper era of conservatism, this last 9 years, has sort of accomplished for conservatism in Canada?
Well, of course, the Prime Minister came in, he was as leader of the opposition then, but really came in with the thought of uniting the Conservative movement in a political party, federal political party, and has been tremendously successful on that. I mean, the party had gone through so much tumult before that. It had been, it'd been put in the penalty box because of that. It wasn't able to gather any kind of significant momentum or certainly achieve any political power. So, his first, as far as the movement is concerned, his first achievement was to actually bring that together. And it was against all odds, and as you know, at the time, it was against even a lot of the spoken commitments from people in all political parties that it would never happen over my dead body. But he was able to do that. It was actually kind of the first public example of his strategic thinking. It was really, he had a long-term view on it. He was convinced it had to happen, and really it was his the exercise of his office that actually made it happen. And since then he's been in like flint.
Has it changed the discussion much? Because I think the Liberals had such a long time in office, and the conservative parties, I guess, had various chances, and it wasn't clear whether they could break through, whether they could become part of the conversation. And there'd also been, I think, I think there was maybe even a little touch of, within mainstream discussion, this sort of like, well, what is the Conservative Party? Or, can they be trusted to govern? What will that be like? Do you think the conversation has changed significantly? Are the Conservatives now a comfortably mainstream party in Canadian politics?
Well, certainly they've broadened their appeal since my early involvement. I mean, when I started, it was a regional rump, if you will, and it was a Western-based party and with national aspirations. But it's been broadened since then to a pan-Canadian party with inroads in kind of untraditional or non-typical areas in the multicultural community and so on. So they have broadened their appeal and have made it more pan-Canadian and have there's no doubt about their national aspirations. So it's a solid political movement. What the caution always is that there was, in the early days when we kind of put it all together, there was an awful lot of emphasis on the mechanics of doing that. So there was the United Alternative, and there was renaming of parties, and trying to split the baby, so to speak, and in a political sense of what can we all do a little of in order to make this all happen. And so what always the caution, or the reason, not even the caution, the reason there's something like the Manning Center conservative movement idea is that we want to make sure that the ideas that underpinned it all don't get lost in the political shuffle, because it's extremely important to have the politics right, internal politics and external communication, but that can't be what it's all about. And in the end, it's about doing something, not just holding power. And so what this kind of a conference allows is for a much more free exchange of ideas. So while others are worrying about how to raise $10 million for the upcoming campaign, we'll leave them with that, and we'll talk about ideas and concepts and international and other things that are happening that you need to be aware of as a conservative. Don't lose sight of the fact that conservative principles and values are underpinning all of this. So it's not just an election machine, but there's actually a reason for holding power.
And you think those ideas have been furthered in the last 9 years?
Well, they have been. It's interesting. You always find purists that say, it's not enough of something, but it's, in a sense, you have to look back at where we were and where we are now. So, or what would have happened if the other guys had been in power.
Right.
So, my old portfolios, I think of things like the position on the wheat board would not have changed if the Conservatives hadn't been here. So they have a more free market attitude toward both on trade, specific things like the wheat board and other policies like that, very specific, an absolute commitment to reducing tax loads and so on. So those things are kind of threaded through it all. The reality is, of course, is that politics is also the art of the possible. And so sometimes you'll get purists, and I always like the purists. I like them beacon off now and again to make sure that we remember where the true North Star is. On the other hand, the political reality is that you govern for all of Canada, not just for the purist in the back room. So that's also happened along the way, and it's necessary.
Do you think Canada has changed?
I think that's also true. I mean, because it's almost just a demographic reality, and in part, I think that's helped the Conservatives as well. And people are, the country demographically is a different group, and that's why they were smart, and why I was so pleased that they made such an effort to reach out to them in a multicultural way. So what was seen before as there's only one party you can vote for, the Liberal Party, if you believe in immigration or multiculturalism or whatever, that dynamic has changed. So it's not like it's 100% conservative now, but at least it's a good balance of, as it should be, a balance of people and competing ideas right across the country and in all those sub-communities there. So that's been very good and very healthy for the movement, where it would have died on the vine if it had stayed like a 1960s party.
Do you think the Conservative Party can become, the old idea was that the Liberals were the natural governing party of Canada, and they were very successful in the 20th century. Can the Conservatives be that new natural governing party, or maybe politics are even too volatile at this point? But can the Conservatives be that dominant party going forward?
One of the things we said at the Manning Centre was, as a broad objective, what if instead of only holding office 1 out of 3 elections, you held office 2 out of 3 elections? Then realize you're not going to be there forever. But what if, on average, instead of always being in the opposition, that you did your share of time across the aisle? And you kind of set that as an objective. And I'm going to talk about that here at the conference as well, about the need to think not just about the federal system, but across the country at the provincial level. Is some concern in some jurisdictions that they are spending way too much time in opposition. If it becomes a reality that this natural governing party mantra of the Liberals becomes a reality at the provincial level, and you have 3, 4, 5 elections in a row with the same government, then don't be surprised if it heads in a direction that Conservatives aren't comfortable with. So we have to break that. You have to just say somewhere along the line, you have to say, everybody gets a turn in the democratic system, but if the other guys with a different set of values and principles than yourself are holding sway most of the time in most jurisdictions, then you're not going to be happy with the outcome. That outcome is going to be different than your vision and your principled view of what Canada and the provinces might look like.
Aside from sort of the speculation that always comes about when the Prime Minister will step aside, eventually he will not be the Prime Minister, whether that's next year or 10 years from now. What happens to the Conservative Party then? Can it hold together the fiscal Conservatives and the social Conservatives and all the disparate groups that it's brought together over the last 9 years, or are there still issues that are going to have to be worked out? I think of abortion, I think of, now assisted suicide. Like, are there issues that could threaten to pull that coalition apart?
Well, it's certainly been strengthened by the strength of the party and the fact that they went through some ugly times prior to Mr. Harper and Mr. McKay putting it together. In the final word, they went through such awful times that that is kind of burned into our DNA a bit right now. So if you want to fight amongst yourselves, you can be sure you'll spend a good long time in opposition. So that's kind of, people got to get that in the Conservative movement. But one of the reasons for the Manning Conference is to give a venue, if you will, for movement Conservatives to come together and network and exchange ideas and kind of have a friendly to and fro amongst mostly like-minded people without the friction of the political party, like the political leadership race, so specifically to your question. So my hope is that as time goes on, that it'll serve a purpose. It's not even a an outlet for there's nothing pent up. Just that over the long run, I think it will be very healthy if there's this kind of a conference instead of us versus them, that a leadership race will bring. In fact, I think in the post-Harper world, whenever that might be, that this kind of a conference will be even more important, because it's right now there's absolutely no, that I know of, absolutely no pressure on Mr. Harper to step aside. He has his firm control. He has full support of the caucus and the party. So he's in a great position politically that way. But for any new person that comes in, there'll be an us versus them. There'll be at least 2, maybe 10 people that want the job. And the danger is that it splits the party and it allows for that division to last way too long. I think this conference, which is becoming increasingly a go-to event for people of all different backgrounds, and my hope is that even in the whatever down the road, even in the post-provincial leadership race, for example, that there'll still be people here who say, well, I didn't vote for you and I voted for the other person, but I'm here together with other Conservatives, realizing that in the end we're going to have to pull together.
Thanks, Chuck.
Okay.
I'm here with Kristen Annis from Canadians for Clean Prosperity. I want to talk to you a little bit about carbon taxes and pricing pollution. But first, just what is your group? Can you give us a quick sketch of who are you guys?
Yeah, sure. So thank you. Canadians for Clean Prosperity is a grassroots organization, and we're building a movement across Canada of Canadians, businesses, communities, individuals that support a strong economy, lower taxes, and less pollution. And the mechanism for doing that is really using market mechanisms and free enterprise to kind of solve pollution.
Right. And you have a sort of an entrepreneurial edge to your group, right? You have some people who are business people interested, not enviro weenie Sierra Club people, but business-oriented people, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, no, that's
okay.
Right. Our board is comprised entirely of entrepreneurs.
Right.
Our advisors kind of run the spectrum as well. We've got, in terms of our advisors, we've got Todd Hirsch, who is an Alberta economist. Right. We've got Don Drummond, chief economist of TD Bank.
These are people who are hardcore people interested in the free market.
Yep.
Okay, so you're coming to the Manning Conference where people are, there's a good swath out there that doesn't want to hear about carbon taxes. And I know you're interested in pricing pollution more broadly, but that's the issue that people here are mostly thinking about.
Yeah.
If you had to say to people, don't be afraid of carbon taxes, Conservatives, it makes sense for you. What's the brief case? What's the short case?
Yeah, so I think there are kind of 4 benefits to it, but one of the first things to remember is that really, this is an opportunity to cut taxes on things we want more of, like jobs and income.
Right.
So you can take every single penny that's collected in a carbon fee and use it to cut taxes, income, payroll taxes, what have you, things that are actually growing our economy and our prosperity.
Right.
So that's one of the main benefits. A price on pollution also does allow the market to really step in and start to innovate and solve those problems. And so I think that's the other key thing with that price signal.
So it should be a natural for this crowd, but it isn't for some reason. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think one of the reasons is that, there is a certain mistrust in government, that if government takes something, they're not going to give it back. And I think that's where our group comes in, because we really are there to help hold government accountable. And we can do that. We've seen it work in BC, where BC actually has refunded every single penny
of their carbon
fee. They've refunded BC citizens to the tune of $5.6 billion.
It's sort of a pilot project I think a lot of Canadians aren't really aware of outside BC.
Yeah, so it has been successful. And it hasn't tanked the BC economy. BC government was one of the only ones to post a budget or balance their budgets in 2014. And their rates of growth are comparable, if not stronger, than other areas of the country.
Ontario's the front line right now in this, right? If you were talking about the Ontario government contemplating some kind of price on carbon, what are the principles they should be applying as they consider that policy?
So we actually have a campaign running right now in Ontario, because Ontario has come forward and they've said that they want to put a price on carbon. So we're very much in support of that idea, the market mechanism being put in place. But, and it's a big but, we only are supportive if they confirm that they're going to refund every single dollar in the
So
form
a
of tax
revenue
reductions.
neutral carbon price of some sort where everything goes back to...
Absolutely. To citizens, to businesses, to communities, so that we can grow and prosper. It's not, this shouldn't be a discussion about the size of government or whether we're going to fund, the deficit or pension plan. Like, it really is an opportunity to cut taxes on things we want more of. And just back of the envelope math, I mean, you could see tax reductions, if they followed the BC model, tax reductions of $3.2 billion a year to Ontarians. So it's a huge opportunity, right?
We've talked about BC and Ontario, which raises the next question I have in mind. Somehow has this important policy debate become a provincial debate in Canada? Is it sort of impossible for it to now vault to the federal level where we talk about a national carbon price of some sort?
Yeah. So I think both ways to approach it are possible. Provinces have different pollution profiles and they have different economies. So it might not be kind of a one-size-fits-all approach that is going to work for each province.
Right.
Alberta has their levy in place. They may choose to expand on that. But it's really a question of what's the most cost-effective way to do this? At some point, you might want the federal government, to participate and help with harmonization and to make sure that businesses that come in aren't dealing with kind of 10 different pollution
Or shopping
regimes.
Around for the best regime? Is that a good thing, maybe, in a way that they shop for the best carbon regime?
I think we're agnostic on that. Like, it is about competition and really figuring out the best way to reduce it at the least cost. So, but I think there's a role for the federal government.
Because finally, you were on a panel this morning with Bob Inglis, who's a conservative voice in the U.S. in favor of carbon pricing and other kinds of pollution pricing, which puts in the minds, I think, of a lot of people in that room. Ultimately, is it essential that Canada harmonize with the U.S. on this kind of pricing, or is that a false hurdle to put in front of this kind of policy debate?
Well, I think, there's an important role for Canada. I mean, we are a smaller market. Even, I think, California is a bigger market than us. But there is an important role. I mean, even with the BC example, they're performing kind of a leadership role. And some of the innovations that come out from Canada are indeed social innovations. And so we can show, Mr. Inglis was saying, it's important for Canada to take leadership, to show Americans, if at least psychologically, they're not alone on this issue.
American conservatives.
American conservatives, even. And so I think there is definitely a role for Canada and Canadians and the provinces to showcase how this can work. And already with BC, we're seeing, some of the Western states looking quite closely at what BC has done and using that as saying, this works. Like, we can do this. This works. And I think there's really an important role for Canada to lead on that issue. And we've led on a million of other issues before this. Why not this one, right? Yeah.
Kristen, thanks a lot for talking to Maclean's. We appreciate having you here.
Thank you.
Dr. Jack Mintz, thanks so much for sitting in our pop-up studio here at the Manning Networking Conference.
It's my pleasure to do.
And let's talk a bit about income splitting, which you just spoke about at a session. A lot of the criticism of the government's income splitting proposal is centered on the notion that it favors high-income earners, and you spoke to that in the session. And in fact, you talked about how if that were our judge for a policy's success or not, we'd actually have to take a look at a lot of other policies that also benefit high-income earners and high-income families. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. No, I think one of the risks in tax policy discussions today is to use the lens of who benefits higher low-income people from every type of tax policy change, because many tax policy changes are done for very good reasons. For example, getting more fairness between different types of taxpayers, or because we're trying to encourage certain types of activity, like charitable contributions. And so, if you look at, for example, the child care deduction, 60% of it is claimed by the top 25% high-income households in Canada, the top quartile. If you take charitable credits, again, much more than 70% is claimed by the top quartile, and same thing even with education and tuition fee credits. They tend to go more to the top income groups than lower income groups. But we do these policies because we want to encourage people to get an education. We want them to contribute to charities, and it doesn't matter what your income level is. We're trying to achieve these things, and to me, income splitting is a way of addressing an unfairness in the tax system where single earner families are taxed much more heavily than a dual earner family.
Right. Do you think the government's broader tax package responds to some of those concerns, nevertheless, that income splitting does benefit largely high incomers and high income families?
Well, I think the tax package itself, really provides a lot of benefits to a lot of different families in different ways. So certainly it has a broader application than the income splitting proposal itself. I'm just trying to argue that income splitting itself was quite appropriate to address, because right now there's a lot of high income families through their business and investment income can do a lot of splitting of income. And why can't we let the poor worker, that policeman, that teacher, that social worker have an opportunity to split income as well when it comes to their labor income?
Sure. Can you talk a bit about the splitting that is already allowed and that CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency, sort of accepts as perfectly legal, perfectly acceptable?
Well, it's perfectly legitimate. So let's to give an example. Let's say if I wanted to split some income with my wife, and if she does an investment, I can lend her the money. There's an income attribution back to me for the loan, but it's not a difficult way of trying to split income. Also, for many people that want to organize their business affairs, you can, a spouse can be a partner in a business, and again, splitting income is not very difficult to do. It's not a matter that the CRA takes a blind eye. They're very, they administer the act quite properly, but it's the policy that's been accepted over the years because of the way that it's been developed in trying to deal with our pretty complex society.
Sure. Is that widely enough known that the kinds of people who may benefit from income splitting know that those mechanisms exist and already take advantage of those?
Oh yeah, no, I think a number of people have done it, and it is widely done.
Sure. And how
Although
does that?
I think I haven't seen any data to actually show
Sure,
that.
sure. Do you know how that breaks down among various income earners, high, low, and somewhere in the middle, and who takes advantage of those measures more often?
My suspicion, and again, no one's actually done a really careful study of this, but my suspicion is that it would be more in the middle and upper income groups.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
I see the long-term prospects of the Canadian economy continuing to improve, to have strong fundamentals to be able to run a government. I see continued increased opportunity for young people to get ahead in this economy and to spur the next innovation for the next generation. And I think most importantly, I continue to see Canada have a stronger and growing voice, speaking up for those in the world who can't speak because their governments persecute them.
So Dwight, I guess, because judicial activism gets talked about a lot, and sometimes I wonder whether people just mean it in the sense of they don't agree with the laws or they liked the laws that ended up being struck down, or they don't agree with the judicial decision. So, is there kind of a way of defining judicial activism that you think is sort of, puts a kind of boundary on what exactly that means?
Well, I don't think it's simple, because I agree with the sense that sometimes that's the way people use it, is to describe decisions they agree with and decisions they don't agree with. However, I think we could distinguish between decisions where the court is operating within its role versus decisions where it may be expanding or overstepping its role. Or decisions where the court is operating within traditional conceptions of, for example, rights and freedoms, and those where it's adopting a novel interpretation of rights and freedoms that's less rooted in those traditions. And so I think we could have principled ways of distinguishing between activist decisions and non-activist decisions.
So, to take from your panel, you were talking sort of about recent decisions. Is there an example from those decisions where the court, in your mind, went beyond what it should have done, or not should have done, but beyond how it should have acted or should be acting?
I think there have been recent decisions where it has taken on more of a policymaker role than it had to do. And in some of those decisions, it's been overturning past precedents without even necessarily explaining as fully as one would hope why it's doing that. And in doing so, it's taking on some novel interpretations of certain rights. And obviously the law isn't static and may change over time, but when it takes on very novel interpretations of certain rights, there is room to say that it's engaged in some degree of activism.
What does that mean? Because I heard that come up, this idea that, it went against precedent, which I guess to my, I'm not steeped in sort of legal, legal ideas, but this idea that it went beyond precedent, why is that necessarily, or why could that be a bad thing? Because it seems to me that, well, the world changes, things change. Right. Why wouldn't the court change?
Right. I mean, the idea of precedent is that unless there's a strong set of reasons for changing, that you would stick with the decision that's been made, because otherwise people don't know what the law is. In order that they can follow the law, they're guided by the past decisions, and so the courts should be also, unless there becomes a strong reason to change. And when there is, courts may change precedents, but they should offer a very well-articulated reason why they're changing when they do that. And I'm not convinced that in every recent case they've articulated a sufficiently powerful set of reasons for changing precedent.
For the average, voter, citizen looking at this, beyond whether or not they agree or disagree with the decisions of the court, is this something they should be concerned about? And then, how should they view the way the court is acting and what it's doing? Should they be should there be some way that they should imagine the court changing or the legislature changing to sort of set things to arrive at a better balance, I guess?
Well, one of the difficulties is that when the court makes a decision based on constitutional rights, it very much limits what legislators can do after that. These are often difficult questions where there's balancing of different things at stake. And when the court ends up making the decision, it may mean that there's no more opportunity to make a democratically chosen decision, to engage in democratic debate about the issue. If the court's decision applies for some period of time, there's a consequence now that debate is essentially shut down on the issue. And so I think citizens should be concerned about that, because on these big issues, citizens should be engaged in those issues, and people won't all agree over those issues, but we have a stronger democracy when people are engaged with those and argue about those and make decisions through democratic means where that can be done, rather than those decisions being made through the courts that don't engage in that same range of discussion.
In terms of, to use the most prominent case that we're getting right now, the assisted suicide decision, you had some concerns with the way that ruling was written, but in terms of the idea of judicial activism and how the legislature should be working and how our democracy should be working, I guess, do you have specific concerns about how this issue has played out?
Well, the court certainly has put Parliament in the position of having to do something, and do something very fast. On an issue where Parliament has dealt with the issue before in voting down a number of bills. It doesn't say that Parliament shouldn't be considering the issue, but Parliament could continue to consider it in light of broader public discussions, without the court saying that unless something is done in the next year, this declaration comes into force that strikes down the law in part.
If I understand the court's ruling, it comes on this idea of people suffering, and so how should Parliament, and how should the public then deal with that? Like, should Parliament be free to ignore that fact, or is the court right to step in and say, no, what the current situation is unacceptable?
Well, certainly if there are people that are suffering constitutional harms or constitutionally recognized harms, there is a role for courts to step in those issues. But they could make different kinds of declarations than what they've done. And Parliament could want to respond in very different ways than what the court has effectively forced. So if Parliament responded with a really good palliative care strategy for Canada. Right now, it seems that that wouldn't actually even allow it to proceed without still changing the law. And that's a response Parliament might want to pursue, but the court's decision no longer allows for that at the present time.
All right, thank you, sir.
Sure, thank you.